Imaginarium Theater has recently dropped, and I'm sure many of you are eyeing up all those random characters that you haven't touched for years, due to needing to flesh out your roster more. After all, Theater's stage demands that you build multiple characters of each element in order to conquer it effectively. But with such a large roster available, with almost everyone being viable, who do you choose to build? That's what I'm here to help you out with today. I'll analyze each and every Pyro, Electro, and Anemo character available in the game right now, and decipher how good they are for Imaginarium Theater based on resource efficiency, how low their investment floor is, and whether they can be used in any other area of the game well. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. Before I burn the house down with my insane rankings, because as always I'm highly aware of how my rankings videos are often received as the worst thing to grace this earth, allow me to provide some assumptions that I'll be working with so we can at least be all on the same page. 4 stars will be C6 holding their best 4-star weapons at R5, and 5 stars will be at C0 with their best 4-star weapons. The reason I'm going for lower assumptions is because Imaginarium Theater has super weak mobs, so you don't need insanely high-end gear to clear it. I value how cheap are they to start working, how flexible are they in various scenarios, can they run rainbow builds comfortably, are they able to run well in a solo setting, can they be used anywhere else outside of Theater with their cons, passives, etc., how well do they work with other characters in their season. Each segment of the video will focus on one element. I'll start with Pyro, then move on to Electro, then finish with Anemo. Solo also means within the context of Theater, which would mean being the only one in the team doing damage, with all your supports being borderline nonsense, because you have to fully fill out your team of 4 and can't do anything to change it, essentially making it a solo run, because those others might as well not even be there. And now for the disclaimer that I'm gonna have at the beginning of all my ranking videos from here on out. Take these rankings with a huge grain of salt, because tier listing is an awkward metric because there's so many variables at play, and different situations can favor a normally bad character to be really good and vice versa. This video is more focused on the character analysis and drawing out the positives of each and every Pyro, Electro, and Anemo within Theater with a rough estimate of their rankings on top. Okay, let's go. Arlecchino. She's everlasting as the moon. Really strong start with this character, she's incredible. While she is a hyper carry, she does still do really nice DPS at lower free-to-play investments, for example White Tassel, and for Imaginarium Theater, even level 80 with a level 8 normal attack should get the job done very comfortably. She's one of the most adaptable DPSs out there, being able to play a Mono Pyro, Overload, and Vaporize super well. Being good in Mono Pyro and Overload is super useful for this Imaginarium cycle, with Pyro and Electro sharing a spot. You can easily use 4-piece gladiators on her, which is not a hard set for anybody to achieve. It's the most accessible set in the game, and anybody will gain some alright pieces even after a few months of playing. She's one of the strongest solo DPSs that you can play, so if you end up with a nonsense team, she'll still go incredibly hard. She is a DPS, not a support, so she will always be the head of the team. But yes, she is obviously worth the build, one of the best DPSs in the game right now alongside having super flexible comps. Works great with most units in her season, would really appreciate having Bennett, Chevreuse, or Kazuha on her side, otherwise she can just solo and cook. Real teams involving her include Chevreuse Overload and Arlecchino Mono Pyro, top of S tier. Speaking of Chevreuse Overload, she is insanely good this season, even at C0, though we assume C6 here. In terms of cheapness, you can shove her on a triple HP build and slap any ER weapon on her, or dialogues if you have it, and then you're ready to rumble. Her buffs are so valuable in a restricted setting like this. Run her on HP for her attack percent buff and healing in particular. She's unfortunately not much of a solo character since she's an overload support, but allow me to discuss something more worthwhile. If you're forced to play an Anemo at the end of your team, is she still good? Yes. Her C6 works even if you don't proc Overload, and so does her A4, and an Anemo's 4VV makes up for the A1 loss. So you really get the best of both worlds with Chevreuse, as long as you're using a Pyro or Electro DPS. She is pretty much just an Overload unit, but you can DPS her with C6 Bennett against Hydro Tulpa, which is pretty neat, honestly very strong. And she won't do much for the likes of Xiao, Wanderer, Hazo, etc., but she will do wonders for Arlecchino, Clorinde, Raiden, etc. S tier behind Arlecchino. Lyney, the cheat code of Genshin. He honestly does want a fair bit of investment to hit the ground running, but Imaginarium's mobs are super easy to clear, so don't sweat it too much. 4-piece Mayonnaise Hunter is very flexible, otherwise you can just run a 2-piece set and clear Imaginarium fine, because he just does that much damage. Yes, he can solo very well, and outside of Imaginarium, he can be used as a crazy speedrunner DPS in Abyss with vaporized comps. For the uninformed, go try it out yourself, yes he is good in vape. Otherwise, you can run him as a great consistent monopyro unit. You can use monopyro in this Imaginarium season actually, which is one of his naturally best in slot teams. But otherwise, being stuck with Electros won't ruin him, he's good enough solo. But I recommend wasting trash pyros to fill out your Lyney teams to fill out his pyro passive, for example, Amber and Xinyan and whatnot. S tier, carried by the fact that Lyney himself is just insane. Hu-Tao, amazing pyro DPS. Level 90 is appreciated because of the HP scaling, but level 80 will be fine. She does require more talent investment into your normal attack first, then skill, then burst last. She can run Shimei Awas pretty comfortably. I'd avoid Crimson Witch of Flames because you won't be vaping, otherwise Crimson is fine if you want the overload effects, or 2-piece sets. Make sure to use an HP % Sans and a non-elemental mastery weapon because you won't be vaping. Otherwise, Crimson Witch of Flames is fine if you want the overload effects or 2-piece sets. Make sure to use an HP % Sans and a non-elemental mastery weapon because you won't be vaping. She can be a great solo DPS, and if you're running Crimson Witch, then she also has healing self-sustain. Obviously one of the better vape DPSs in Genshin Impact outside of Imaginarium Theater, and a great double Hydro driver outside of Theater as well. She doesn't work great with others in her season, honestly. Xianyun and Bennett are cool though. A tier, carried by how neat of a DPS she is. Now for Bennett, the true Pyro Archon, not Lance Step Aside. He's super cheap to get going. He wants a high base attack weapon, his main stats and crit don't matter. Just shove ER on him. Noblesse is also strong boxable. Noblesse is preferred, especially since no vape equals no instructor's value, but he will work competently on anything since his buffing has nothing to do with his main stats and artifacts. Try run him on a standard build of energy recharge, HP % goblet, and a healing bonus % circlet on 4-piece noblesse, so you can work on his healing and consistency, but otherwise don't sweat it, he'll work just fine. And if your Bennett is C6, he can drive some funny setups on Thundering Fury and use pyro normal attacks, but he's not a solo unit by any traditional means. And must I explain how Bennett is worth building for an account outside of Theater? Really? He works well with essentially every main DPS in this season, minus Clorinde because she hates Circle Impact the most. Obviously S tier behind Lyney. Oh no, it's Xiangling! It's not necessarily that Xiangling is cheap because she really wants C4. This list does assume C6 though, but I wanted to throw in that disclaimer. But she does use pretty much every other stat ever, minus HP and defense, really well, and has an amazing free weapon in the catch, or you could even use Favonius Lance if you're cat sharing. So that C4 is honestly a fair trade-off for how valuable the rest of Xiangling is. Just make sure you have enough energy recharge and level her burst up to 8 minimum. That's before the +3 increase, otherwise make that 11. And bro, it's Xiangling. She's obviously flexible as long as you have the energy recharge to compensate. She can run so many wacky combos in terms of sets. Rainbow builds are fine as long as you have the mains and subs to give her the stats she wants. She's not great solo because her damage does fall off when Bennettless or buffless on the whole, and the kid named energy recharge will be very, very sad. And it's Xiangling! Of course she works everywhere outside of Theater! She works very well with Monopyro with Lyney, or Arlecchino. She works with every DPS here in general, Need and Chevreuse overload teams. On the whole, very, very nice this season. A tier at the top above Hu-Tao. Now for that boy Gombing. Is he cheap? Well, unfortunately that boy gets finished in Theater because you have no Farina, which is a unit he really relies on. Also, whether you get Xianyun in a team with him is a lucky coin flip. Not that flexible either since he's a main DPS, a great one at that though. He runs 4-piece Mayonnaise Hunter, but you can also run 2-piece sets, and he's not very good solo since he does want his buffs, but in Theater he will do fine. Thing is, he's still worth the build in my opinion, because even with his Imaginarium handicaps, he's so damn strong for a 4-star DPS when put in Plunge Vape outside of Theater. So yes, build him for Imaginarium to flesh out your roster because the enemies aren't hard enough for his handicaps to be that detrimental. And then when you get around to using him outside of there, you will cook. He works nicely with Xianyun and Bennett in this Theater, otherwise B tier. Now for Klee, the Bakudan kid. Cheap enough, just run with Ziff. She's usable as a pyro battery in general, but because she's an on-fielder that really limits her flexibility, she can run 4-piece Wanderer's Troop since it's strong boxable, otherwise 2-piece is fine, and she'll do alright solo in theater. She works very well with Xiangling, consider yourself lucky if you can play those two together in a round, and if you already have her, great mono pyro battery outside of theater, and great for Furina reverse vape. Those are great teams, especially in AoE, but no need to chase Klee for them. These are more just uses if you already own her. B tier ahead of that boy Gaming. Thoma. Problem is that he simply doesn't get to use his best use case here, which is Burgeon, so he's pretty much either a Tao charge attack buffer or use of Clorinde overload. Yes, he's cheap, just shove him on HP and ER. If you run standard EM, then he should be fine enough that you don't need to totally change his build for theater, but then his shield will be weak as poop. Just use the trial version to save yourself hassle, honestly. He can run the rainbow sets fine, and solo there's not much value there. He's a support obviously, you'll never be relying on his damage. He works nicely with Tao and Clorindius, otherwise just an awkward sustain option. C tier. Now for Yanfei, Klee Part 2. I'm gonna be honest, basically all of the same points from Klee apply here, except that her pyro application is less so her battering isn't as insane. Also, Klee does reverse vape for Reyna outside of theater, better for that reason. Though her C4 allows her to be a shielder outside of theater, honestly a fairly well-rounded unit, top of C tier. Then for Diluc. Diluc got saved by plunge vape. Bro is not plunge vaping here. He's not that cheap, he wants his ideal teammate, sadly can't access Furina here. Crimson Witch of Flames will be neat here, otherwise just run 2-piece or Rainbow. Solo he will be serviceable enough, and he works very well with Bennett and Xinyan, but lacking vape really hurts the guy. Pretty much in a similar position to that boy Gaming, arguably a bit worse, and he's now the new top of C tier. Dehya! Well... cheap enough assuming you run a tank build, just run her standard builds, otherwise Rainbow is fine. Her DPS is in the trenches without C1, and this is a C0 5-star tier list. I can't make exceptions due to risk of inconsistency. She works great with Bennett, Xiangling, any of the pyros, but won't see use outside of that. D tier. Amber! It's getting worse! Help! Cheap if you're using her as an elegy support, her other DPS playstyle is very rough without her best melt team. Running instructors is kinda wasted here, no real sets for support Amber. I guess Noblesse? No way you are soloing with Amber. There's no synergy she has which really cooks. F tier. Yoimiya! You can run Ruster Hamayumi and she'll be alright. Shimenawa's is an easy choice for her, sadly Rainbow builds are weak on her. Solo will be rough in non-boss stages, since Imaginarium is primarily AoE centric. No vape really hurts, but Chevreuse overload can work for her. Yoimiya goes into C tier, very mediocre, albeit serviceable. Xinyan! No! Moving on. Jokes aside, with C6 Bennett she's an alright monopyro driver. Problem is that she's too expensive to make deal any DPS and just isn't worth it at all outside of theater. Buggy shield too. She'll work nicely with Bennett, and otherwise F tier. Then for the Electros. Clorinde. Cheap enough, shove her on Finale and she'll start cooking. She does want level 90, but that's more her outside of theater aggravate comps. For a primarily aggravate unit, she's honestly very flexible. She can use hypercarry teams of Kujou Sara or overload teams of Chevreuse, both of which can work within this theater season. Sadly no Yunjin available to us. She doesn't really love rainbow builds, no. Run her on Harmonic or Thundering Fury. She solos better than you'd expect, especially in theater setting. Don't apply this to Abyss though, she wants her buffs there. Really neat aggravate, overload, hyper, and quote-unquote physical DPS who can also do quick bloom outside of Imaginarium. Works very well with Chevreuse and Fischl this season, otherwise gets along fine with most units. A tier. Almighty Shogun time. I'd say you need to hit her breakpoints for her to feel comfy. Get that 200 plus ER. Otherwise, she's cheap enough she can run catch in a strong boxable set like EOSF. Raiden is so good in theater because she's so flexible in many team scenarios super comfortably. Soloing Raiden is fine as long as you use everyone's bursts even if they're useless for her, e.g. Farizan's burst in a non-Anemo DPS team, so you can stack Resolve. Farizan does use Viridescent Fenrir, let me just quickly throw that in there. Raiden outside of theater is mostly a Hyperbloom bot or a double Hydro driver. She works nicely with Kujou Sara and Fischl this season, and just everyone in general. A tier behind Clorinde, though they are close, arguably equal. Fischl! Nice and cheap, can easily run stringless. It's Fischl. She is the goddess of flexibility. She can run goofy builds fine, yes, though 4-piece Golden Troop is highly appreciated. Fischl isn't really a quote-unquote solo character, better to have her paired with a DPS she can assist energy-wise, but she does put in some solid work. Amazing aggravate unit outside of theater, otherwise she's a nice flex slot in pretty much 80% of Genshin Impact teams, though never strictly best in slot. Loves working with Clorinde, who everyone has access to via trials, also Raiden and Alhaitham. A tier above Clorinde due to her flexibility, which theater adores. Now for Yae Miko. She's not that cheap, she wants her good build, she's flexible as a sub DPS, I know she has egregious field time, but that may be okay depending on whatever team you end up with, e.g. Xiangling is your other damage dealer, who is an off-fielder as well. Yae Miko can run Rainbow fine, she solos nicely since her burst packs a punch, though energy recharge might brick that. Usable outside of theater as a wonderful aggravate DPS, though Clorinde power crept her. She works great with Fischl and Alhaitham, top of B tier. Alright, so Keqing. Listen, Keqing is good because she's a Fischl driver and aggravate. There is no aggravate here without Beidou, so she's not that competitive with Yae. However, her DPS is still fine enough to clear the trash mobs. Cheapness is okay since she doesn't really care for Thundering Fury outside of Dendro comps anyway. Dude, anybody who existed before 3.0 knew what Keqing was. She'll solo AoE chambers fine, really nice Fischl driver and aggravate outside of theater, especially cool for a standard 5-star unit. Yeah, being in a season without Dendro hurts her, it's either you run her with Beidou or else. B tier behind that boy Jiaming. Beidou, she's cheap enough, give her an average crit ratio and she'll work. She's flexible, really nice in AoE, so she likes Imaginarium. She runs Rainbow fine and doesn't run overly well in solo, but she can manage. Usable in Taser or AoE Clorinde Overload, and Beidou loves working with Fischl for the ER. B tier behind Yae Miko. Kujou Sara wants a high base attack weapon with good energy recharge, which is kinda hard to balance if not playing with Raiden. She's not that flexible, she's only gonna cook with Raiden or Clorinde, but to be fair, those are really good characters. Runs whatever build she wants, though Emblem of Severed Fate is best in slot for her DPS. And no, she is bricked as a solo carry. She's used as a Clorinde hyper or Raiden buffer outside of Imaginarium, so at least she can play her most comfortable roles here. Works great with those two, otherwise no cigar. B tier. Kuki Shinobu. Super cheap to run, just shove her on HP and EM. She's a flexible healer, runs Rainbow very well in fact. No, she will not carry you, especially without Hyper Bloom available to her. Really good Hyper Bloom trigger outside of theater. In theater, without it, she's a lot weaker. Works well with Alhaitham and spread, but otherwise no specific synergies this season. C tier. Cyno, the guy. He's not cheap at all, he wants his signature in best in slot teams, he falls off hard without, can't access those things in theater, he doesn't like Rainbow, run him on Gilded Dreams or Thundering Fury, and he can carry a stage fine on Thundering Fury because of ER. He's expensive, albeit quite the solid quick bloomer outside of theater, great if you can get all of his necessary equipment. Cyno Overload with Chevreuse will work fine in this theater though. C tier. Lisa, she's very cheap. Flexible, but there's no reason to run her in this Dendroless season. She runs pretty terribly solo. Nice free-to-play aggravate unit and a Eula support outside of theater. As for seasonal synergies, yeah, E tier. Dori, Electro driver who works nicely in Quick Bloom and can drive arena teams as a Raiden decoy. She's cheap enough with Favonius or Sack. Run whatever set, it'll work fine. No, she's not gonna be soloing you because she does 0 damage, not gonna carry. And she's an okay Electro driver outside of theater. Works fine to heal and self-apply Electro outside of the game mode, especially as like a decoy Raiden in some teams. E tier ahead of Lisa. Now for Razor, not that cheap if you want him to be a good DPS out of his Thundering Fury gimmick, which he doesn't have here. Not that flexible as he's the main DPS with no real off-fielding benefits. You can also run 2-piece on him, and he'll solo fine if you've built him up enough. He can be used a lot better outside of theater as a funny gimmick character with the 4-piece TF set in Dendro, which has surprisingly decent performance. Thundering Fury. He doesn't have extreme synergy with anyone in this particular season, D tier ahead of Dehya. Now for Xiao, the king. Yes, he is very expensive in the sense that he really likes having a 5-star weapon and a ton of attack, but the enemy bar to entry is so much lower here, so a 4-star weapon is fine. I'd run 2-piece on him if you don't have Vermilion hereafter, and he solos theater stages so well, both in AoE and single target. One of the best hyper carries in the game with the correct investment outside of theater, super worth the build, but please acknowledge that outside of theater, he does want a lot more expense poured into him for the ever harder getting Abyss. Bottom of S tier. Xinyan. Scatter, Skyward. Super neat and cheap. Sticky R and attack percent on her with Song of Days Past. Viridis and Venerer works as well, but the kid named Swirl setups will be mad. Flexible literally everywhere as a Jean substitute, otherwise enables plunge playstyles for many characters. You can run whatever, sure, but Song of Days Past is super universal, so use it if you have it. She's a support, so no, she won't solo carry at C0 as a non-DPS. Amazing Xiao support outside of theater, otherwise fixes Diluc, and buffs up that boy Gaming, and is just insultingly good on the whole. S tier ahead of Xiao. Kazuha. It's Kazuha, bro. 180% ER plus some EM and you're good to go. It's Kazuha, bro. He's flexible. Run 4 VV, Rainbow build's not recommended unless you're looking to do some goofy Thundering Fury stuff, and honestly with Sacrificial Sword and enough reactions going on, yeah, he can do a solid bit of damage in AoE. He can be justified nearly everywhere outside of theater, obvious S tier behind Chevreuse. Venti! Peak T! Peak, 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 peak! Anyways, super cheap, just shove ER on him and he's ready to rumble. He's super flexible, his swirl is strong enough to murder small enemies in his suck AoE, quite a few good DPSs like Raiden and Lyney can hit within his burst as well. Much like Kazuha, if you have enough reactions going on, you can trust him to carry the earlier easy stages, and he can be used nicely as a great grouper in Wanderer teams or Noivy teams, Lyney, etc. He's not gonna beat Kazuha, but at least he's cuter than Kazuha by a significant margin. Nah, I'ma keep it real, Kazuha is kinda mid design-wise, Venti clears. A tier behind Hu-Tao. Wanderer, also fairly expensive, but much like Xiao, that's negated here, and he's also cheaper than Xiao in my opinion. Plus, he's a trial option. He's flexible enough, just save your Farazan for him, everyone has access to one this time around. Don't run Rainbow. Run his dedicated set if you own him, otherwise run the trial one. Yeah, he can carry you just fine, granted you kept onto your Farazan, and a very good Anemo DPS outside of theater, though he's more single target centric than Xiao in my opinion. He works very well with Farazan obviously, and Bennett. Top of A tier, Xiao's AoE is what pushes him one tier above. Farazan. She's super cheap, her buffing relies on like 0 stats. She's not that flexible, mostly only good for Xiao and Wanderer. Run Rainbow if you want to, or just use the trial one. She's not the team carry, so don't rely on her for that. She can be used outside of theater for Anemo DPS buffing, though with on 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, you can at least make some use out of her if you end up stuck with her when you don't need to use Farazan. Great with the aforementioned outside of theater obviously. A tier. What she provides these two is incredible, and Scara is a starting unit, so that's guaranteed. Sucrose is the definition of cheap. Run on triple EM, throwing tails to Dragon Slayers, done. Mega flexible, though her EM share is weaker without vaporizing this season. I would force 4VV over Rainbow building EM main stats. She won't carry you solo, but she's a nice support to have, even with the Anemos as a solid battery, especially with C1 and sac frags. She's nice in Vape and Aggravate with Hakushin Ring outside of theater, well worth the build if you're okay with the clunkier playstyle, works nicely with all the potential units she can play with, A tier behind. Lynette, she's cheap, what a shocker, all Anemos are at this stage, just run whatever with Favonius on her. Flexible in the same way the other Anemos are, force 4VV as always, once again nice support, not a great solo runner, but her C6 does make her a solid contender for an Anemo DPS of C6 Farazan, so if you want to be funny, go for it. She's usable outside of theater as a cheap Aggravate free-to-play option, and she works well with most characters in the season, there's no real anti-synergies here, the mixed teams may even let her max out her passive which provides everyone attack based on how different the team's elements are. No real qualms here, top of B tier, lower than Sucrose since her grouping isn't as good. Hazo. Cheap enough for VV driver or dedicated Anemo DPS, but because you have a trial Scaramouche here, I'd prefer running him on 4VV. He can be flexible like the other Anemos, just like Sucrose if you run him supportively. Many forget how his A4 grounds the whole team a flat 80 EM share. Not that that's needed this season, but there's a fun tidbit for ya. Run 4VV! Force it! Lock it in! He can carry you fine in a solo setting, preferably with a sub-DPS like Fischl or Xiangling to help out. He can be used outside of theater as a mid-Anemo DPS or an OK Sucrose replacement or driver. Bottom of C tier. Sayu, you know the drill at this stage. 4VV already adds a bunch of value, etc, etc, top of B tier, since she has some healing which is cool. Jean. She is simply better Sayu who is good for all the same reasons, plus Sunfire. These Anemos at this stage start to have the same talking points, so I don't want to yap about the same thing over and over again for too long. Bottom of A tier. Now for the special guest stars. Beidou is very nice and cheap since he just runs HP. Super flexible as a Dendro healer, you can run 4 Deep Wood or 4 Clam. He will not solo carry you of course, but it's nice that he's here since he allows characters like Clorinde and Yae to access Aggravate, their best teams, e.g. Clorinde, Fischl, Beidou, Sucrose, or Kazuha. Amazing all-rounder Dendro support outside of theater, but if you're using him in theater then you have him anyway. Works very well with the Electros this season, A tier above Jean. I'll hype him. He's cheap in the sense that he can run a 3-star weapon super effectively. He wants to use Yae Miko, Fischl, Raiden, etc. so he can run spread, run Gilded Dreams or 4-piece Deepwood if he's a solo Dendro, which he most likely will be. He's reaction based, so his soloing will honestly kinda disappoint. Amazing quick bloom DPS with fantastic free-to-play friendliness outside of theater, works great with the Electros this season, but no cigar otherwise. Top of B tier since he's fairly restrictive, but Beidou is more worth the pick if you got him. Now for Ryovesley, Riothesly, Riesly. Blood is not cheap, he wants a C1 to even start working properly. Imaginarium's bar to entry is low enough for C0 to be fine though. Rio's not that flexible, he wants characters to support him, mostly pyro so he can melt. His solo performance will be fine for you, but reminder that the Copper Duo has huge cryo res, so don't rely on him to clear that for you without a pyro by your side such as Xiangling. Much better outside of theater in the Abyss where he can run Farina for his best in slot team, Rio, Farina, Bennett, Xiangling. That's where he excels. Not amazing this season without Farina available, top of C tier. Sigewinne. Oh god, not another Sigewinne discussion again. Cheap enough to work, though. Not that flexible. Her hydroplication is so low that it's not like she'll be resurrecting Vape for anybody. Can run whatever set, honestly. Her DPS is not high enough for her to solo carry without R1 minimum, and even then that's pushing it a bit. Usable outside of theater as a Kokomi downgrade, while being a Kokomi sidegrade in Monohydro and Farina Fischl Taser. C tier behind Yanfei. You can now raise up your pitchforks and launch them at me. Imaginarium Theater is honestly a really easy game mode, so I'm not sure how helpful this video was for you guys. Let me know down below in the comments. And as always, we will always have vastly differing opinions, so go ahead and tell me everything you agree or disagree with down below in the comments, as I'd love to hear your thoughts. A character that was S for me may be B for you, and a character that was C to me may be A to you. The C6 Farina Healers Rankings video is still coming, by the way, to all of my regulars who are still awaiting that one. I intended to have it out earlier, but I will still have it out at least a week before the current patch is over. Appreciate everyone's patience waiting for that. I'll also be streaming 4.8 special program tomorrow live on my Twitch and here on YouTube, so join my Discord, which is linked down below in the pinned comment and description if you want updates on when that's happening. Thanks for listening to my Yap Fest. Hopefully this video is able to help you decide who the best units are for this 4.7 season of Imaginarium Theater. This has been Juice, signing out, and if you want some nightmare fuel when going to sleep tonight, imagine a Dendro Cryo Geo season. Sleep well.